this is also a summer when we celebrate another anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the encyclical Humanae Vitae by Pope Paul VI, 1968, July. In that famous document, infamous in some circles, Paul VI, the successor of Peter, fundamentally reaffirmed the unbroken Christian tradition for nearly 2,000 years that contraception is against the design of the Creator. There was no one in 1930 years that was ever a prominent Christian teacher that ever disagreed with this teaching. No one. None of the famous Protestant theologians, no one. This was the constant teaching of the Christian tradition, unbroken. And Paul VI, under enormous pressure, reaffirmed that teaching. And in fact, he said that the Christian tradition, that marriage is the sexual act of marriage is to express the mutual love of the spouses and to fulfill God's injunction, be fruitful and multiply. It's the second that contraception takes away. And we could apply the words of Jesus, I think, about marriage to this question of contraception. What God has joined together, man must not divide. Think of it just for a second, that if everyone has the right, or if it's right for everyone, every couple, to say whether or not marriage will involve both the expression of love and the generation of children, then what happens after a while if first one person, then two people, then a majority, then almost everybody decides, well, we're not going to generate children. We're just going to have the pleasure of union. What happens to the human race? What happens to the human race if everyone makes that choice? Fortunately, not everyone has, but a lot of people have, and so we see this decline of population around the world. Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical, very briefly said that sexual behavior, sexual union, though it is, of course, the most intimate personal union, has profound social consequences. And these were not well accepted in 1968, but let's consider whether time has proved him right. He said there would be 4 consequences of the use of contraception. 1, there would be a general lowering of moral standards throughout society. 2, that there would be a rise in infidelity in marriage. 3, that there would be a lessening of respect for women by men. 4, that there would be the coercive use of reproductive technologies by governments, especially on the poor. I say those very rapidly. I would invite you to look them up and to consider for yourself whether he wasn't an accurate prophet. But that strikes me in thinking about what this contraceptive revolution has done is to simply and immediately dispense men from any responsibility for their sexual behavior and to leave the entire consequence and the burden of sexual behavior on women. It has had effects, though, on Catholics, as we all know. This teaching, when Paul delivered it, was met with unprecedented rejection, and as one person said, execration. It was despised in the world and also within the church. There were theologians that rose up and proclaimed that this was mistaken and wrong. And for years and years, and until this day, the faith of Catholics has been unsettled by this. I don't know if yours was, but I know that mine was for years, because I didn't want to hear what the Pope, have the Pope tell me what I didn't want to hear. And so later, when one begins to look into it, different perspective emerges. This disregarded and undefended teaching now begins to come forth in a different light, 40 years later, I believe. But it did lead to a sort of a pick-and-choose Catholicism, that if I can dismiss this teaching of the Church, then I can dismiss that one, and I can pick the ones that I want, and that's fine. And so we have a lot of the chaos that we have in the Church today. But 40 years is long enough to take the measure of Humanae Vitae's truthfulness, I believe. And if the Pope was right and the tradition is right about contraception, then perhaps it is right about such things as abortion, lived-out homosexuality, in vitro fertilization, embryonic stem cell research. These fundamental moral questions that face us as a nation, as a people, are rooted in this teaching. And it is good for us to reconsider them again. Even if contraception itself is not a live option in your life, what effect has it had on your faith? And what do you think of the teaching of the Church in regard to this issue? This is something well worth examining. Because if this one teaching in the face of the world's complete rejection is true, then perhaps everything else is true all the way down and all the way up. And if I live in the confidence of that truth, then what can overcome us? There is no need for the crowd to go away, Jesus says. Bring them to me. And so he gave the blessed bread to the disciples, who gave them to the crowd. We can imagine the astonishment of the apostles as they fulfilled this task, because they had, just minutes before, none of the resources to fulfill it. But when they obeyed Jesus, they found that he had a capacity to satisfy way beyond their imagining. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up the fragments left over.